This online tutorial contains 4 illustrative exercises that are intended to serve as opportunities for the users to better understand CORSIA's design elements and implementation aspects. For the purpose of all the illustrative exercises, a simple CORSIA world was created, representing the CORSIA states, aircraft operators of those states, and routes between the states. In this CORSIA world, there are 10 states, states A through J. 11 aircraft operators registered in 8 of the CORSIA world states, as there are no aircraft operators registered in state I and state J. And 24 routes flown by the aircraft operators in this CORSIA world. Throughout each of the exercises, relevant data for the states is provided to you to assist in working through the exercises, such as the state's voluntary participation status, revenue ton kilometers or RTK, and classification. For example, those that are classified as small island developing states, landlocked developing states, or least developed countries. For aircraft operators in the CORSIA world, emissions data for selected years are also provided for the exercises. The first of the 4 exercises focuses on the state participation and emissions coverage in CORSIA, where you are asked to identify or calculate several items. For example, identifying routes covered by CORSIA in different phases, identify CO2 emissions covered on different routes, calculate the total CO2 emissions covered by CORSIA in different years, and calculate the individual RTK shares and cumulative RTK shares, as well as identify states that are exempted from the CORSIA in the second phase. States' participation in CORSIA is voluntary for the pilot phase, which is 2021 to 2023, and in the first phase, from 2024 to 2026, as defined in Resolution A39.3, Paragraph 9. As you can see from Assumption Table 1, of the 10 states in the CORSIA world, states A, B, D, and I are voluntary participants from the pilot phase, and 2 additional states, F and G, volunteer starting from the first phase. Assumption Table 2 includes CO2 emissions generated by different airlines on different routes in different years. Per Resolution A39.3, Paragraph 10, CORSIA applies to international routes between states, both of which participate in the scheme. Based on the assumption tables 1 and 2, you are asked to identify the routes that are covered by CORSIA in the pilot phase and first phase, then identify CO2 emissions covered on these routes, and to finally calculate the total CO2 emissions covered by CORSIA in 2021 and 2024. It's important to note that Assumption Table 1, which identifies voluntary participating states in the pilot and first phase, is only an illustrative example of the state's voluntary participation in CORSIA. Also, Assumption Table 2, which identifies emissions of individual airlines in selected years, are also an illustrative example of the routes operated by different airlines and their respective emissions. You should use Assumption Table 1 to identify the states that have volunteered to participate in the CORSIA, and to identify the routes between these states in the table provided in the exercise sheet. It should be noted that the table includes states that are not voluntary participants from the pilot phase but will join CORSIA starting in the first phase. After identifying the routes that are included in CORSIA, participants should find the respective emissions from the Assumption Table 2 and fill in the emissions into the table provided in the exercise sheet. Finally, total emissions covered by CORSIA should be calculated at the bottom of the table. As a helpful hint, there are state pairs such as GF and DG, which would be included into the offsetting requirement of CORSIA. However, there are no airlines operating on these routes. Now, let's check the solution for the first exercise. The first task is to identify the routes that are covered by CORSIA in the pilot phase during the year 2021 and the first phase during the year 2024. Based on the data in Assumption Table 1, during the pilot phase, 4 states have volunteered to participate in CORSIA and are highlighted in green. Through CORSIA's route-based approach, a total of 6 routes are covered, which are identified by the red checks. Remember that the route will only be covered by CORSIA in a case where both state of departure and the state of arrival have announced their participation in the scheme. In the year 2024, 2 additional states, F and G, have joined for a total of 6 states that have volunteered to participate in CORSIA. Again, through CORSIA's route-based approach, 5 additional routes now qualify, for a total of 11 routes that are covered. Using the information on which routes are covered and the data in Assumption Table 2, the CO2 emissions covered in the qualifying routes can be identified. The CO2 emissions from each of the 6 covered routes in the year 2021 are indicated by the red numbers in CO2 2021 column. Just as a reminder, the CO2 emissions per route is data created only for the purposes of this exercise. The CO2 emissions from each of the 11 covered routes in the year 2024 are indicated by the red numbers in CO2 2024 column. To calculate the total CO2 emissions covered by CORSIA in 2021 and 2024, simply sum the CO2 emissions values for the covered routes in the respective year. The total CO2 emissions in 2021 is 346, while the total CO2 emissions in 2024 is 638. It's interesting to note that not only did total CO2 emissions value increase with the addition of 2 participating states, constituting 5 more covered routes, but within the span of 3 years, the CO2 emissions on each route also increased, which contributed to the increase in total CO2 emissions in 2024. From the second phase, starting in 2027, CORSIA applies to all states that have an individual share of international aviation activities in RTKs in year 2018 above 0.5% of total RTKs, or whose cumulative share in the list of states from the highest to the lowest amount of RTKs reaches 90% of total RTKs. In addition, exemptions are provided to the second phase of CORSIA for states that meet certain socioeconomic criteria. It's also important to note that these exempted states are encouraged to volunteer to participate in this phase, as per Resolution A39-3, paragraph 9. The second part of Exercise 1 is to calculate the individual RTK share for each state and the cumulative RTK shares, as well as to identify states that are exempted from the CORSIA in the second phase and why. Just as a reminder, revenue ton kilometer, or RTK, is defined as revenue load of passengers and cargo in tons multiplied by the distance flown in kilometers, thus the RTK levels corresponding to the volume of air transport activity. RTK data is being reported to ICAO by member states as part of ICAO's statistics program and published in the annual report of ICAO Council. RTK data for year 2018 will be used for the purposes of determining the exemptions from the second phase of CORSIA. Assumption Table 3 presents illustrative RTKs per state in 2018. Individual RTK share is calculated by dividing the state's RTKs by the total RTKs of all states. For the ease of calculations, the total RTKs are 1,000 in this illustrative exercise. Cumulative RTK share counts individual RTK shares together from the highest to lowest. In other words, by starting with state with the highest individual RTK share, in this case state A, and adding the next highest individual RTK share state, in this case state B, you calculate the cumulative RTK share for the international aviation sector. Just as in the individual RTK share, the cumulative RTK share will never go above 100%. Finally, there are 5 of the 11 states that are exempted from the CORSIA in the second phase in this scenario. 4 of these states are exempted based on their individual share of international aviation activities in RTKs is less than 0.5% of total RTKs, and cumulative share in the list of states from the highest to the lowest amount of RTKs greater than 90% of total RTKs. These states are G, H, I, and J. In addition, 3 of the states are exempt under the classification of those that are designated as small island developing states, landlocked developing states, or least developed countries. These states are C, H, and I. Of course, states H and I can't be exempt twice, but this is an example of how a state could be exempt under different criteria.